The year was 1887, and for Clara May Dawson, the world ended at a small railway station called Willow Creek. The sky was the color of a bruised plum, spitting icy flakes that vanished on the cold, dark wood of the platform. Steam from the resting train engine hissed like a nest of snakes, a sound that seemed to crawl right inside her worn-out coat. She was 27 years old, and she had never felt so old, so finished. In her pocket was a letter, now just a worthless piece of folded paper. The words on it had promised a new life, a husband, a home, a mail-order bride, a simple arrangement. She had traveled 1,000 miles with that promise warming her chest, a tiny flame of hope she'd guarded against the biting winds of her life. Then he had seen her, the man whose name was on the letter. He took one look at her patched dress, her tired face, the hunger in her eyes that no amount of pride could hide, and he had simply turned his back. No apology, no quiet word of regret. Just a cold dismissal, as if she were a piece of livestock found to be lame. The rejection was so sharp, so brutal, it stole the air from her lungs. And the whispers started immediately, little verbal stones thrown by the onlookers, turned down right on the platform. Look at her, not even worth a second glance. Shame was a hot physical thing, branding her cheeks and the back of her neck. She clutched the handle of her scuffed satchel, the only thing in the world that was truly hers, and wished the ground would open up and swallow her whole. She wanted to dissolve into the steam, to become nothing more than a ghost on the wind. And that was when a tiny voice cut through the cold and the cruelty. "Are you my mommy?" Clara's head snapped up. Standing before her was a little girl, no older than 3. She had a riot of golden curls escaping her bonnet and cheeks so red from the cold they looked like ripe apples. Her dress was as patched as Clara's, her little boots scuffed at the toes. But her eyes were the color of a clear summer sky, and they were fixed on Clara with an unnerving intensity, a look of pure, undiluted certainty. The little girl tilted her head, took a small breath, and said again, this time a whisper filled with a strange conviction, "I can smell you. You smell like a mommy." Before she even knew she was moving, Clara's knees hit the rough planks of the platform. A sound, a broken thing between a sob and a gasp, was trapped in her throat. She had no one, no family, no children, no place to call home. And here was this tiny stranger looking at her as if she held the answer to every question the child had ever asked. A trembling, gloved hand came up and brushed a stray curl from the little girl's forehead. It was an involuntary act of tenderness that broke the dam inside her. She pulled the child into her arms, and the little girl fit perfectly, as if she were a missing piece of Clara's own soul. The tears came then, hot and silent, streaming down her frozen cheeks. She was just a woman, broken and alone, clinging to a stranger's child on a train platform in the middle of nowhere. But she wasn't alone. A shadow had been watching the whole time. Silas McGrath stood a few feet away, a man who looked as if he'd been carved from the hard, unforgiving landscape around them. He was tall and broad, his face weathered by sun and sorrow, his eyes hidden in the shadow of his hat brim. The whole town knew he was a widower, but no one dared speak of it to his face. His wife had died 2 years ago, leaving him with their daughter, Ellie Rose, the same little girl, now clinging to Clara as if she'd found salvation. Silas watched them, his face a mask of stone, but something in the set of his jaw tightened. He saw the way the strange woman held his daughter, the way her shoulders shook with silent sobs, and it stirred a feeling deep inside him he'd long since buried. Fear. He cleared his throat, the sound harsh in the cold air. Clara looked up, her eyes wide with alarm, and her arms instinctively tightened around Ellie Rose. Silas took a step forward, his boots heavy on the wood. "She doesn't talk," he said, his voice a low rumble, rough as gravel. "Hasn't said a word in a year, not to anyone." Clara could only stare, confusion warring with the raw emotion choking her. He wasn't looking at her with pity. He was looking at her as if she were a dangerous complication, a problem he didn't know how to solve. "What did you say to her?" he demanded, his eyes the color of a gathering storm, finally meeting hers. Clara shook her head, finding her voice. "Nothing. She spoke to me." The statement hung in the air between them, an impossible truth. Ellie Rose looked up at her father, then back at Clara, and her little hand reached out to touch Clara's cheek. Silas's expression hardened. He bent down and scooped Ellie Rose into his arms, his movements stiff and angry. The girl whined, reaching back for Clara, but he ignored her. His gaze fell on Clara's single satchel, on the thinness of her coat. "You were the one for Abernathy," he said. It wasn't a question. Mr. Abernathy was the town banker, the man who owned half of Willow Creek and held the mortgage on the other half. The man who had just discarded her. Clara nodded, her shame returning with a vengeance. "Yes." "You've got no place to go," Silas stated, his tone flat and cold. It was a grim transaction, not an offer of kindness. "My cabin's warm. You can stay the night. You'll work for your keep, and then you're gone." He turned and started walking without waiting for an answer, as if her agreement was irrelevant. Clara hesitated for only a second. The wind bit at her face, and the eyes of the town were still on her back. She had no money, no hope, and nowhere to go. With a deep breath that felt like swallowing broken glass, she picked up her satchel and followed the silent man and the little girl into the growing dusk. As she walked, she couldn't shake the look she'd seen in his eyes. It wasn't pity or kindness. It was raw, primal fear. What on earth was he so afraid of? The walk to the cabin was a silent journey into a vast, empty wilderness. The prairie stretched out on all sides, a sea of snow under a sky that was turning a deep, starless black. Silas didn't speak a word, carrying Ellie Rose, who had fallen asleep against his shoulder. Clara followed, the crunch of her boots in the snow, the only sound accompanying the mournful howl of the wind. The cabin was small, little more than a dark shape against the horizon, with a single thread of smoke rising from its stone chimney. It looked less like a home and more like a fortress built against the world. When Silas pushed the heavy wooden door open, the scent of wood smoke and something else, a deep, lingering sorrow, spilled out into the night. The inside was brutally simple: a rough-hewn table, 2 chairs, a stone fireplace, and a narrow cot pushed against the far wall. It was clean, meticulously so, but it was the kind of clean that comes from emptiness, not care. There were no pictures, no knickknacks, no sign of a woman's touch. It was a place where a man and a child existed, but did not live. Silas laid Ellie Rose on his own larger bed in the corner, pulling a thick wool blanket over her. He turned to Clara, his face illuminated by the flickering firelight. "The cot is yours. There's stew on the stove. Chores are on the table. Be up before dawn." He moved with a heavy weariness, a man carrying a burden so immense it had become a part of his bones. Clara, desperate to do something other than stand there feeling useless, went to the stove. She ladled the thin stew into a bowl, her hands trembling. As she turned back to the table, her eyes fell upon the mantelpiece above the fireplace. There, half hidden in the shadows, was a small silver-framed photograph. She stepped closer, her heart giving a strange, painful lurch. It was a picture of a woman, smiling a sad, gentle smile. Her hair was the same shade of brown as Clara's, her eyes the same shape, her jawline just as delicate. She was thinner, prettier perhaps, but the resemblance was so stark, so uncanny, it was like looking at a reflection in a warped mirror. She could have been Clara's sister, or her twin. A cold dread washed over her. She finally understood. Ellie Rose hadn't just seen a kind woman on the platform, she had seen the ghost of her mother. And Silas. Silas hadn't just brought a stranger into his home, he had brought home a living, breathing reminder of the wife he had lost. The fear in his eyes suddenly made perfect sense. Every time he looked at Clara, he wasn't seeing her at all. He was seeing the woman he'd buried. This wasn't an act of charity, it was a form of self-torture. He was testing himself, pushing his own grief to its breaking point. And she was the weapon he was using against himself. He gave her a list of chores the next morning that would have broken a draft horse: splitting wood, hauling water from the half-frozen creek, mending a fence in the biting wind, scrubbing the floors until her knuckles were raw. He was trying to drive her away. He wanted her to quit, to flee back to the shame of the town so he could be alone with his ghosts again. But Clara didn't quit. She had nowhere else to go, and a stubborn spark of defiance had ignited within her. She would not be broken again. She worked from before the sun rose until long after it set, her muscles screaming in protest. She fell onto her cot each night in a state of pure exhaustion, only to rise and do it all again. And in the small moments in between, she started to fight back against the crushing emptiness of the cabin. She found a cracked jar and put a sprig of hardy winter pine in it. She used a bit of saved flour and lard to bake a small, dense loaf of bread, filling the cabin with a scent it hadn't known in years. These were small rebellions, tiny acts of life pushed up through the frozen ground of Silas's grief. Ellie Rose seemed to blossom under her care. The little girl was still silent with her father, but with Clara she would point and make small noises, her blue eyes bright with unspoken questions. Clara would talk to her for hours, telling her stories, teaching her how to fold a napkin, showing her the patterns the frost made on the window pane. One evening, Silas returned from trapping, his face grim and dusted with snow. He stopped dead in the doorway. The scent of roasting rabbit and herbs filled the air. A small fire crackled cheerfully, and Ellie Rose was sitting at the table, her head bent close to Clara's, who was humming a soft, simple tune as she braided the child's hair. It was a lullaby Clara's own mother had sung to her, a melody of comfort and peace. Silas dropped the stack of firewood he was carrying. It hit the floor with a loud, crashing thud that made both of them jump. Clara looked up, startled, and saw his face. It was a mask of pure horror, his eyes wide, his skin pale. It was the lullaby. She knew it instantly. It was the exact same song his wife, the woman in the photograph, used to sing. The first few weeks in Silas McGrath's cabin were a silent war. He fought her presence with cold indifference, and she fought the crushing sorrow of his home with relentless work. Silas never called her by her name. To him, she was just woman. He'd leave the list of impossible chores on the table each morning and be gone before she was even out of her cot. He was a ghost in his own house, his grief so profound it was like another person living with them, a cold shadow that touched everything. But Clara refused to surrender to it. She was fighting for more than just a roof over her head now. She was fighting for the little girl who had started to follow her everywhere, a silent, wide-eyed disciple. The town of Willow Creek had not forgotten her. When she was forced to walk into the mercantile for supplies, the whispers would start again. But now they had a new, sharper edge. They were no longer just about her rejection at the station. They were about her living under a widower's roof. The whispers were being led by one man in particular, Mr. Abernathy, the banker, the man who had cast her aside. He would watch her from behind the counter of his bank, his eyes cold and assessing. He made sure everyone knew the story, painting her as a desperate woman of loose morals, insinuating she was taking advantage of a grieving man. He was the one who started the ugliest rumor of all, the one that was whispered behind cupped hands, the one that said Silas's wife, Sarah, hadn't just died in an accident, the one that said a man as strong and silent as Silas McGrath was capable of anything. Clara felt the town's judgment like a physical weight, but the rumor about Silas chilled her to the bone. She watched him now with new eyes. She saw the raw power in his hands when he split logs with a single blow. She saw the darkness that sometimes flickered in his eyes when he looked out over the empty prairie. Could a man so consumed by sorrow also be capable of violence? The thought was a poison that seeped into her mind. She started to feel like a prisoner, trapped in a remote cabin with a man who might be a monster and a town that had already condemned her. The fear was a constant metallic taste in her mouth. Then Abernathy escalated his campaign. He wanted her gone. Clara realized it wasn't just about his own bruised pride. There was something else at play, something she couldn't yet see. One day, the owner of the mercantile, a man who owed his business to Abernathy's bank, refused to sell her supplies. "Your credit is no good here," he said, not meeting her eyes. She was being starved out, isolated. But Clara was a survivor. She set traps for rabbits, foraged for edible roots the snow hadn't yet covered, and stretched their meager supplies with a skill born of a lifetime of poverty. She started a tiny protected garden against the cabin wall, coaxing green shoots from the frozen earth. Her defiance only seemed to make Abernathy angrier. He wanted Silas broken, and Clara was somehow holding him together. She knew then that this was about the land. She'd heard talk in town that Silas's property had the only reliable spring for miles, a source of water that would be priceless as the railway expanded. Abernathy didn't just want Silas to fail, he wanted his land. One night, the war came to their doorstep. A rock crashed through the small cabin window, shattering the precious glass and letting in a blast of freezing air. Clara screamed, rushing to Ellie Rose, who was crying in her bed. Silas was across the room in an instant, rifle in hand, his body tensed for a fight. But there was no one there. Only a rock on the floor and a piece of paper tied around it. Silas picked it up, his face grim in the firelight. He read the crude letters scrawled on it. Clara came to look over his shoulder, her heart pounding against her ribs. The message was simple and brutal. Get out or you'll end up like the last one. The threat hung in the cabin, colder than the winter air pouring through the broken window. This wasn't just gossip anymore. This was a promise of violence. Clara was terrified. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like an approaching footstep. The rumor that Silas had killed his wife now felt like a very real possibility. Maybe he had, and maybe she was next. Her survival instinct screamed at her to run, to take her chances in the wilderness, to face the freezing cold and starvation rather than stay another night in that cabin with a man who might be her executioner. That night she waited until Silas was asleep, his heavy breathing filling the small space. With trembling hands, she packed her meager belongings into her satchel. She would leave before dawn. She would disappear. She looked over at Ellie Rose, sleeping peacefully, her small face soft in the moonlight. A pang of guilt hit her, sharp and painful. But her own life was at stake. She had to go. She slipped on her worn boots, slung the satchel over her shoulder, and moved silently toward the door. Her hand was on the wooden latch when a tiny voice whispered from the darkness, "Don't leave me, Mama." Clara froze, her blood turning to ice. Ellie Rose was sitting up in her bed, her small silhouette outlined by the dying embers in the hearth. The child's voice was not pleading. It was a statement of fact, a quiet acknowledgement of a terrifying truth. In that moment, Clara knew she couldn't leave. She couldn't abandon this child to the darkness that surrounded this family, whether that darkness came from the town or from the man sleeping just a few feet away. Running was no longer an option. Her fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was now overshadowed by something else, something fierce and protective. She had to fight back. She had to find the truth. What really happened to Sarah McGrath? And why was Abernathy so desperate to get his hands on this land? She let the satchel slide from her shoulder. Her new mission began. She started searching, quietly, carefully, when Silas was out of the cabin. She looked for a clue, a letter, a diary, anything that could shed light on the mystery. She felt a profound sense of guilt, invading the privacy of a dead woman, but her own survival and Ellie Rose's depended on it. For days she found nothing. The cabin was as barren of secrets as it was of comfort. Then, one afternoon, while sweeping near the cot where she slept, her broom snagged on a loose floorboard. Her heart hammered against her ribs. With trembling fingers, she worked the board free. Underneath, nestled in the dark, cool earth, was a small, locked wooden box. She worked at the rusty lock with a piece of wire, her breath held tight in her chest. Finally, with a soft click, it sprang open. Inside, there was no diary. There was a bundle of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon. With a sense of dread, she opened the top one. The handwriting was elegant, masculine. The words were a torrent of passion and poetry. They were love letters. But as she scanned to the bottom of the page, a chill went through her that had nothing to do with the cold. They were signed, "Forever yours, Alistair, Alistair Abernathy," and they were written to Sarah McGrath. The letters told a story that made Clara's blood run cold. They started as passionate declarations of love from Abernathy to Sarah, but her replies, which were not there, must have been rejections. His tone began to change. The passion twisted into obsession. The poetry became laced with threats. He wrote about Silas with a venomous jealousy, calling him a simple, dirt-scratching brute who didn't deserve a woman like her. He promised her wealth, power, anything she wanted, if she would just leave Silas and come to him. It was clear she had refused again and again. The final letter was dated the day before Sarah's death. The elegant handwriting had become a jagged, angry scrawl. It was barely legible, a testament to the rage of a man scorned. "If I cannot have you, Sarah, then no one will. I will not see you waste your beauty on that worthless man and his pathetic patch of dirt. I will ruin him. I will take everything he has, everything he loves, until he is nothing but a memory. This I swear." It wasn't a confession of murder, but it was a confession of intent. It was proof of a motive so powerful, so all-consuming, that it could easily lead to violence. Sarah's death had been ruled an accident, a fall from a spooked horse, but now Clara was sure. The horse hadn't just been spooked, it had been driven into a panic, by a man consumed by a jealous rage. Clara sat on the cold floor, the letters in her hand, the terrible truth of it all settling over her. Silas wasn't a killer, he was the victim. He had been living under a cloud of suspicion and grief, all while the real monster, Abernathy, sat in his bank, slowly tightening his financial noose, trying to fulfill the promise he'd made in that final, hateful letter. She had to show Silas. He had to know. He had to fight back. She waited for him to return that evening, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. The sun had set, painting the snow outside in shades of blood and violet. When he finally walked through the door, stamping the snow from his boots, she was standing by the fire, the letters clutched in her hand. He saw them immediately. His body went rigid. The weariness on his face was replaced by a look of sharp, cold alarm. He closed the door behind him, his movements slow and deliberate. "Where did you get those?" he asked, his voice a low, dangerous growl. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the letters, as if they were venomous snakes. "Under the floor," she whispered. "Silas, you have to read them. This changes everything. This is proof." "Proof of nothing." He cut her off, his voice like stone. He took a step toward her, his shadow looming large in the firelight. "It's the word of a dead woman against the most powerful man in the county. It's a fantasy that will get us killed." He reached for the letters, his eyes hard. "Give them to me. You should not have found them." But Clara pulled back, clutching them to her chest. "No, you can't hide from this anymore. He's trying to destroy you, to take your land, to take your daughter. This is why, don't you see? You have to fight him." For a long moment he just stared at her, his jaw clenched so tight a muscle jumped. The air in the cabin was thick with unspoken grief and new terrifying possibilities. He finally let out a long, shuddering breath, the fight seeming to go out of him. "I found them," he said, his voice raw with pain, "right after she died. I read them, and I knew he was behind it. But I couldn't prove it. I had a baby girl to protect. Going against Abernathy would have been suicide, so I buried them. I buried the truth to keep Ellie Rose safe." He looked at Clara then, and for the first time she saw the full depth of his despair. "He's been bleeding me dry ever since. Calling in loans, blocking my sales. He wants me broken, and now you've dug it all up." His voice cracked. "He knows you're here. He won't stop until you're gone. You have to leave, Clara. Tonight. For your own safety." But it was already too late. As if summoned by his words, there was a loud authoritative knock on the door. Silas froze, his eyes locking with Clara's in shared dread. He moved slowly to the door and opened it. Standing on their doorstep, flanked by two burly deputies, was the town sheriff, and behind him, a smug, triumphant smile on his face, was Alistair Abernathy. "Silas," the sheriff said, his voice devoid of warmth, "Mr. Abernathy here has filed a complaint about a theft." Abernathy stepped forward, his eyes glinting with malice. He didn't even look at Silas. His gaze was fixed on Clara. "That woman," he said, pointing a finger at her, "she came to my office a week ago, begging for money. I turned her away. I've just discovered that a valuable family heirloom, a diamond brooch, is missing from my desk." It was a lie, a brazen, perfectly constructed lie. Clara had never been to his office. She'd never even spoken to him after that first brutal rejection. "That's not true," she cried out. "I've never—" "Sheriff," Abernathy said smoothly, cutting her off. "I have a witness who saw her leaving my office around the time of the theft. I suggest you search her belongings." The sheriff nodded grimly and pushed past Silas into the cabin. Clara watched in horror as one of the deputies grabbed her satchel and dumped its meager contents onto the floor. And there, glinting evilly in the firelight, amidst her spare dress and sewing needles, was a large, ornate diamond brooch. It was a perfect frame-up. The witness, no doubt, was someone who owed Abernathy money. The brooch had likely been planted by the same person who threw the rock through their window. She was trapped. There was no way out. That's it, the sheriff said, picking up the brooch. Ma'am, you're under arrest. One of the deputies grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh like claws. No! A small voice screamed. Ellie Rose, who had been hiding in the corner, ran forward. She launched her small body at the deputy, beating her tiny fists against his leg. No, bad man gave it to her. I saw. Everyone froze. The sheriff looked down at the child, then at Abernathy, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. Abernathy just laughed, a cruel, dismissive sound. The child is confused. Pay her no mind. She hasn't spoken in a year. She's clearly not right in the head. His words were a calculated poison, designed to dismiss the one voice that could save Clara. The sheriff hesitated for a moment longer, then shook his head. It's not enough. Take her. As the deputy started to drag a protesting Clara toward the door, Silas stood as if frozen, the letters still clutched in his hand, his face a mask of utter defeat. Abernathy had won. They were dragging her out into the freezing night, the iron-cold handcuffs biting into her wrists. The whole town, it seemed, had gathered to watch the spectacle, their faces pale and curious in the moonlight. They were the same faces that had watched her rejection on the train platform, and now they were watching her being hauled away as a common thief. It was the ultimate humiliation. Abernathy stood on the porch of the cabin, a conquering king, a smug smile playing on his lips. He had taken everything from Silas, and now he was taking the one person who had started to piece his world back together. Inside Silas's mind, something snapped. It was the sight of Ellie Rose, sobbing and reaching for Clara. It was the triumphant look on Abernathy's face. It was the memory of his wife's laughter, stolen from him by this monster. The fear he had lived with for 2 long years was burned away by a sudden white-hot rage. He looked down at the letters in his hand, the brittle paper filled with Abernathy's venomous words. They weren't just proof of motive, they were a weapon, and he was finally ready to use it. He strode out of the cabin, pushing past Abernathy without a word. "Sheriff, wait!" he bellowed, his voice echoing across the silent prairie. The sheriff stopped, turning around with an impatient sigh. Silas walked right up to them, his eyes blazing with a fire no one in Willow Creek had ever seen. He didn't just hold up the letters, he began to read them. His voice, strong and clear, cut through the cold night air. He read the words of obsession, the declarations of twisted love, the jealous rage directed at him. He read the final damning letter, the promise to destroy him, to take everything he loved. A stunned silence fell over the crowd. This wasn't just a simple rancher anymore, this was a husband demanding justice for his dead wife. Abernathy's face had gone pale. He quickly recovered, letting out a short, sharp laugh. Lies. Forgeries. This is nothing but the desperate rambling of a failed rancher who probably drove his own wife to her death. It's his word against mine. He was powerful, confident. He knew how this town worked. Money and influence always won. He looked around at the faces in the crowd, sure of their loyalty, sure of their fear. He had them all in his pocket. He was about to turn away, to order the sheriff to proceed, when another voice spoke up from the crowd. He's telling the truth. The voice was old and weathered, and it belonged to Jedediah, the town's ancient stable hand. All eyes turned to him. Jedediah was a man who rarely spoke, who saw everything and said nothing. He slowly pushed his way to the front of the crowd, his old eyes fixed on Abernathy. "I remember the day Mrs. McGrath died," Jedediah said, his voice raspy but clear. "I remember seeing Mr. Abernathy's horse that afternoon. It was back in its stall, but it was lathered in sweat, like it had been ridden hard and fast. I thought it was strange." Abernathy scoffed. "You're a senile old fool. That proves nothing." "Maybe not," Jedediah said, his gaze unwavering, "but this might." He slowly opened his gnarled hand. Lying in his palm was a small, intricately engraved silver object. "I found this on the trail near the McGrath place a few days later, dropped in the mud. Always wondered who it belonged to." He held it up for the sheriff to see. It was a silver cufflink, engraved with the initials AA. The sheriff looked from the cufflink in Jedediah's hand to the wrist of Abernathy's fine wool coat. There, on his right cuff, was a matching silver cufflink. His left cuff was bare. The gasp that went through the crowd was a single collective sound. It was the final, undeniable piece of the puzzle. The letters, the testimony, the cufflink. It was too much. The wall of fear and influence that Abernathy had built around himself crumbled in an instant. The whispers started again, but this time they were not directed at Clara, they were directed at him. Murderer. The sheriff looked at Abernathy, then at Silas, then at the damning evidence. His face hardened with resolve. He turned to his deputies. "Release the woman," he commanded. Then he pointed at the stunned banker. "Alistair Abernathy, you are under arrest for the murder of Sarah McGrath." The triumph was quiet. As the deputies led a sputtering, defeated Abernathy away, a new silence fell over the town square. It was a silence of shock, of guilt, of a community forced to look at the darkness it had allowed to fester in its midst. Silas didn't watch him go. He walked over to Clara, who was rubbing her bruised wrists, her face streaked with tears. He stopped in front of her, the letters still in his hand. For a long moment he didn't speak. Then he did something he hadn't done in 2 years. He reached out. His calloused, work-worn hand gently touched her cheek, his thumb brushing away a tear. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm sorry I didn't fight sooner." Clara leaned into his touch, a wave of relief so profound it made her knees weak. "You fought when it mattered," she said, her voice trembling. From behind them, Ellie Rose came running. She didn't go to her father. She threw her arms around Clara's legs and buried her face in her skirt. Clara knelt and wrapped the child in a fierce hug. Over the little girl's head, her eyes met Silas's, and in that look everything was said. The walls of grief and fear and suspicion were gone, washed away by the terrible cleansing truth. They walked back to the cabin, the three of them, a strange, battered, but unbreakable little family. The broken window let in the cold air, but for the first time the cabin felt warm. It felt like a home. Their wedding was held in the spring, when the prairie had exploded into a riot of wildflowers. The entire town came, their faces filled not with suspicion, but with a deep, quiet respect. They came to witness the union of the man they had wronged and the woman who had saved him. Clara wore a simple dress, with tiny bluebells Ellie Rose had picked woven into her hair. Silas stood beside her, tall and straight, the shadows finally gone from his eyes. There were no grand vows, no flowery promises. There was only the solid, steady truth of his hand in hers, a silent promise to protect, to cherish, to love. When the minister pronounced them man and wife, a cheer went up from the crowd that seemed to shake the very sky. Clara Dawson, the rejected mail-order bride, was no longer defined by the shame of her arrival. She was defined by the love she had earned, the justice she had uncovered, and the family she had built from the ashes of 2 broken lives. That evening, Clara stood on the porch of her home, watching the sunset, painting the vast prairie in strokes of gold and fire. The wind, which had once seemed so mournful, now carried the sweet scent of new life and the sound of Ellie Rose's laughter from inside the cabin. Silas came to stand beside her, his arm brushing against hers. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the stars begin to prick the deep velvet of the sky. She thought of the journey that had brought her here, the crushing rejection that had felt like the end of the world, but had only been a violent, necessary beginning. Rejection, she realized, wasn't a final judgment, it was just a redirection. A closed door forcing you to find a better one. What seems like the greatest tragedy of your life can sometimes be the very thing that sets you on the path you were always meant to walk. If you enjoyed this story of justice and redemption, a story that proves that home is not a place you are given, but a place you build with courage and love, then don't forget to like and subscribe. Because everyone deserves a second chance at happiness, and sometimes the most beautiful flowers grow in the most unlikely soil.